This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. A big hello to the Voice of Early Childhood community. I'm the founder, Angelica Salinska, and I have a very special announcement for you all. Our 2026 conference page is all launched and ready for you. We have launched the tickets early to give everyone plenty of time to plan and book. So our conference is on the 7th of March 2026 in Nottingham. We listened to your feedback and we have the speakers back again that you are blown away by and wanted to hear more from. We have Matt Baller returning and sharing his insightful work and practice around promoting children's mental health. And of course, Olivia Corbin-Phillip coming back again, this time bringing books to life. We also have our long-awaited guest, Cheryl Warren, joining us to discuss her area of expertise on neurodiversity. We will be sharing the remaining speakers soon, so keep an eye out on the conference page. You can find the link in this episode description. Tickets are already selling, so don't miss out and grab yours. I look forward to welcoming you all. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast, with this particular episode being sponsored by Nursery Kitchen. My name is Angelica Salinska. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Catherine Lipp, who is an early years nutritionist at Nursery Kitchen. So Catherine has been on the Voice of Early Childhood podcast already this year, talking about supporting varied eating habits. And today we're talking about nutritious mealtimes for under fives. And we're really shining a light on nutrition once again, because during 2025, there's been a big focus on young children's nutrition, with the new government nutrition guidelines especially being published for early years settings. So Catherine, thank you very much for coming back onto the Voice of Early Childhood podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
It's fantastic to have you back, and I'm really excited to delve a little bit deeper into some of the topics that we covered previously and something kind of a little bit new as well. So I think firstly, let's get to know your role a little bit more. So you work for Nursery Kitchen. What do Nursery Kitchen do, and what is your role within this?
Yes, absolutely. So Nursery Kitchen are a company who provide food to nursery settings across England. We work hard to create nutritionally balanced meals and snacks specifically for early year settings. Aside from the food itself, there's a big kind of service element of what we deliver as well in terms of food education, a lot of resources and webinars to support the settings, our food partners, as we like to refer them to them as, and also for their parents and families as well. So we're really helping all of our settings to try and establish a whole setting approach to healthy eating.
Yeah, that is so important. So it's not just, we are working with providing the meals and we kind of leave it there. Actually, it's working with everybody involved, all the stakeholders, including those parents. That's so vital. We'll be talking about parents and lunchboxes and all things like that a little bit more later on as well. So your role is really important as nutritionist. So do you give a lot of advice to settings as well then, as well as working within Nursery Kitchen?
Yeah, absolutely. So my role as kind of the early years nutritionist and the heading up the nutrition and policy aspect of that for Nursery Kitchen, I make sure all the dishes and menus are kind of nutritionally balanced and exceed the national guidance when it comes to nutrition. So at Nursery Kitchen, we have our own in-house nutrition guidelines which go above and beyond the national standard, and that's because we're experts in the field and we can do that. So why shouldn't we? We make sure that we're really doing the very best. And it, like you say, Angelica, it does go much further than just the food that we are serving to those settings. It's very much about shaping children's food preferences and developing those healthy eating habits from the very start. So we work closely with our partners to really embed that whole setting approach to nutrition and healthy eating. And we also work quite closely with parents and families as well to really kind of educate, support. It's quite difficult navigating food and food refusal and dietary requirements and weaning and all those really difficult, challenging stages that come through feeding. So we want to be there not just as your food provider, but also as your kind of your food educator, and there as your support team. So you can outsource all of that to us, and we can support both the practitioners but also the parents and the families in delivering that sort of whole setting approach to good nutrition for children when they're really young and when we know it really matters.
So it's really important that parents have that, I guess, a bit more of a support network around them in terms of when, when it comes to meal times and feeding their children, as little ones grow so fast. So I guess there's so much uncertainty from, like you say, from the very beginning and then into weaning. And then as they grow older, they need more food and figuring out those portion sizes and also sugar. So actually, let's move on to that. So it's a bit of an elephant in the room sometimes, I feel like. I guess, how much sugar should under fives be consuming is the big question. But really, that's very there's a very complicated question because there's natural sugars, there's refined sugars, isn't there? So can you unpick that a little bit for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really good thing to talk about because it is quite difficult sometimes to understand, what do we mean by added sugar or free sugars? And the term that we often talk about is this term called free sugars. Now, what that actually means by definition is any form of added sugar. So if you think about sort of your white sugar that you buy in bags or brown sugar that you buy from the supermarket shelves in bags, that's very much your added sugar that you might add to kind of cakes or biscuits or recipes when you're doing baking. And that absolutely is a free sugar. It also, what's included in that free sugar definition are things like honeys, syrups, treacle, things like coconut sugar, agave syrup. There are a lot of really confusing names for sugar.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're sort of quite cleverly marketed to us as like, but this is raw coconut sugar or this is agave syrup. And it has sort of health connotations attached to that. What's really important to remember is kind of not to be sucked in by those sort of marketing terms, those what I call halo health claims that claim to be something that they're not. If it's got the word syrup in there, if it's got the word sugar in there, whether it's coconut sugar or raw cane sugar, it is a type of sugar. So all of those things, and there are hundreds of different names for sugar that you might find on the back of a packet, but all of those things are added sugar. So what we call free sugars. And those are particularly the sugars that we want to be limiting in our diet, and particularly for young children when we know that their eating habits and their taste preferences are developing. What also falls under that definition of free sugar is any sugars that might be naturally present in fruits and vegetables, but they are juices, purees, smoothies, and sugars added to drinks as well. So things like your whole fruit or your whole vegetable or natural sugars that you find in things like milk and cheese and yogurt and dairy, they are not free sugars. They are naturally occurring sugars, and we haven't messed with them in any way. We haven't processed them in any way. So that's what we mean when we talk about naturally occurring sugars. And we don't need to monitor how much of that we're having. It's the free sugars. So it's that added sugar, the sugar from a bag or any honeys, syrups, treacles, also your fruit purees or your smoothies, your juices will also fall under that category of free sugar. And the reason that that's different for when you take a whole piece of fruit and you juice it or you puree it or you blend it, we haven't added any extra sugar, but it does become a free sugar because essentially what's happened is we have taken that whole piece of fruit or vegetable and we've blended it, we've pureed it, we've processed it in some way that we've now deconstructed those cell walls that were there originally. And it becomes what we call a free sugar because we've messed around with it, we've processed it, and the way that our bodies respond to that sugar, the effect that that sugar can now have on our teeth, thinking particularly in relation to children, that has much more of an impact than if we were to eat a whole piece of fruit ourselves. So that's why they fall under that category of free sugar. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about added sugar or free sugars, if you hear that term. To answer your question, Angelica, about how much children should be having of those free sugars, the answer is as little as possible, ideally, in an ideal world. Particularly very young children, they don't need free sugar, added sugar in their diets.
Hmm.
It provides energy, but not an awful lot else. It also has a huge impact on tooth decay. And what we know
Hmm.
from statistics is that children in their early years are experiencing really quite remarkably high rates of tooth decay and having to have teeth extracted under general anaesthetic, and purely because we're having too much sugar in our
Hmm.
diets. So it is something that we really want to be kind of careful about with young children. We can't
Mm.
avoid it completely as a parent because it exists. Children go to parties, there's all sorts of things, and food is
Yeah.
so much more than just nutrition. It is that social aspect.
That's true.
So I think, it is there. We need to acknowledge it. What we do know is that children in this country are receiving far too much sugar.
Hmm.
So actually, very young children ideally would have no added sugar. For perhaps a 4 or 5 year old, the maximum recommended amount of sugar that a child should be having each day is of this added sugar, this free sugar,
Hmm.
a maximum of around 4 teaspoons a day. It's around 16 or 17
Mm.
grams. So
Hmm.
that's the absolute maximum. If we can get below that, then fantastic. Um, the reality is that actually children are having more than 3 or 4 times as much as that.
Mm.
So
Wow.
we're not
Hmm.
just talking about double the amount of sugar, we are talking about 3 or 4 times as much as they should be getting.
Hmm.
So it's a big push that we need to try and get free sugar intake down for young children.
Hmm.
And that's where I think early year settings have a real unique opportunity to really focus on that. Just as you would as an early year setting, do everything else in the EYFS, everything else in that early years curriculum to the best of your ability, knowing
Hmm.
that that is the best practice. We should be doing the same with food. So it's really
Yeah.
nice to see in the new EYFS nutrition guidance that's come into place this September that sugar has been acknowledged, and we are encouraging people to go and read food labels, try and go for the lowest amount of sugar possible. Things like
Hmm.
breakfast cereals, for example, try and make sure it's got a green traffic light label for sugar. The
Hmm.
same if you're making any dessert, second courses, puddings, really monitoring how much sugar you're putting in that. And the new EYFS nutrition guidance says that we shouldn't be serving any puddings or second courses that are high in sugar, which would,
Hmm.
if we were selling them in the supermarket, would then have a red traffic light label.
Yeah. Hmm.
So it's an opportunity to kind of reformulate some of your recipes potentially if you're an
Hmm.
earlier setting, really demonstrate best practice and take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to shape children's preferences, to
Hmm.
get them used to less sweet food, to bring in more savoury things for desserts or second courses. Swap that up with sometimes having a starter, sometimes having a second course. It doesn't always have to be a sweet pudding every
Hmm.
day, because you are shaping that child's routine, you're shaping their preferences, and you're demonstrating not just to that child, but also to the parent and the families, this is best practice. This is what we
Hmm.
should be doing. And this is what's important for children's health and development.
Yeah, yeah, you're so right. It's earlier settings basically modeling that best practice to the children for their future lives, for families, for their home lives and their choices that they make at home and everywhere else they go to as well. And I was just going to go back to you were saying purees and juicing fruits and vegetables. So even if we don't add any extra sugar or add anything, it still becomes a free sugar. So I'm just kind of thinking it becomes, not as healthy as the natural sugars found within those fruits and vegetables. What about with weaning children? And that becomes really difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Something that I get asked a lot around this topic is, what about
Hmm.
that weaning stage when we are blending the foods and we're pureeing
Mm.
the foods? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with pureeing foods for babies because they need that for that
Hmm.
developmental stage. And that's actually an important stage of weaning to get them used to practicing those oral motor skills before we move on to lumpier foods or finger foods.
Hmm.
If it's a weaning stage, don't panic about pureeing or blending or mashing that food. The key thing is what foods are you using for that weaning diet? And that's where a lot of the advice around weaning is very, very much focusing on vegetable led weaning. So when we
Okay.
focus on vegetables, they are naturally lower in sugars compared to the
Hmm.
fruits. So if you have babies who have a purely fruit based diet for the first 3, 4, 5 weeks of their weaning journey, they are going to be used to very sweet tasting foods. We
Mm.
have developed that preference for sweet tasting flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, actually, more importantly than worrying about whether you're blending foods or not and pureeing the foods, I would actually focus more on what those foods are. Can you get more savory, bitter vegetables into those early stages of weaning?
Mm.
Because that's going to have a lower sugar content. And that's also setting some really good preferences, really good feeding habits for later
Mm-hmm.
on. And if you think about it with that weaning stage, we are not using purees usually for a very long period of time. It's those very early first tastes of foods. And
Mm-hmm.
then as soon as that baby is developmentally ready to move on to mashed food and lumpier foods and pieces of foods,
Mm-hmm.
then that's what we would be encouraging families and settings to do. So actually, they're on purees for a really short period of time during weaning.
Mm-hmm.
The difficulty and the danger becomes if we continue to use pureed pouches, particularly
Mm.
the fruit
Yeah.
pouches, for an extended period.
Mm-hmm. So it's best to just puree feed yourself at home rather than using those pouches anyway, because a lot of the time they do have those free sugars in them.
Yeah, and I think again there's a balance, isn't there? So the pouches can be a really useful option for parents who are busy and they don't have
Mm.
time to be pureeing the
Yeah.
food themselves. So again, I wouldn't necessarily say don't use them at all. They absolutely have their place, and I don't want to sort of make parents feel guilty about having to
Mm.
rely on those, because they are a really useful option if you're at that stage of weaning.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just have a look at the packets of those pouches, because sometimes on the front of pack it might give the impression that it's mostly vegetables. If you flip it
Mm-hmm.
over and have a look at the ingredients list on the back of the pack, you will actually see a much clearer breakdown of what foods are in
Right.
that. So
Mm-hmm.
look out for more vegetable heavy, more savory flavors and ingredients, and rely less on the pouches and the purees that are just 100% fruit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes sense. And you mentioned chunkier food and pieces of food as well, moving on from weaning. So let's talk a little bit about choking hazards, because that's a really important thing to address, especially for early year settings, to make sure that they are being as safe as possible. That's also part of a safeguarding issue as well.
Yeah.
So in terms of providing children with pieces of food, fruit, cheese, things like that. What are the, I guess, guidelines around that in terms of what do we cut? How small do we cut the pieces? It can get quite complicated.
It can get quite complicated, can't it? And also, it's a big responsibility for
Mm.
early year settings, and also for parents as well. I will say there is some really useful guidance on this embedded in the new EYFS nutrition document.
Hmm.
So if anyone's listening to this who hasn't seen that already, head to the EYFS nutrition guidance. There are some really useful links to a guide to reducing choking risk and how to cut and prepare different vegetables.
Hmm.
What's really important to say is that every child is an individual, so you need to take into consideration each child's developmental stage and how
Hmm.
they are coping with solid food. How we prepare foods for kind of weaning stages might be different to how you would prepare foods for a toddler or a preschooler. The
Hmm.
overall rule is to kind of look at the size and the shape and the texture of that food. So, really, what you want is the size to actually, I would often say bigger is better. So, bigger pieces of food mean that children not only get to kind of practice chopping skills and using their knife and
Hmm.
fork skills to cut those up into appropriate pieces, but they will also, if it's big, feels big in their mouth, they have to chomp and chew it
Mm.
first before
Yeah.
they try and swallow it down. With a bigger piece of food, there's no risk that it's just going to slip down
Hmm.
and potentially cause a choking risk. So I would often say the bigger the better. So if you're thinking about finger foods, for example, you want something that's about the size of an adult's index finger. So
Hmm.
that length or longer, something that, if it's a finger food for weaning, babies can get their hand
Mm.
around with their fist grip relatively easily.
Hmm.
And you also want to think about kind of the size of that not being too round and chunky. So I would almost go for a wider, slimmer shape. So if you're
Hmm.
thinking about a carrot, rather than doing a carrot batten, how you might sometimes buy them in the supermarket, even if it's
Hmm.
cooked, it's sort of quite square and chunky. If you were to cut it a much wider strip of carrot, but
Hmm.
do it slimmer, um, that is going to be a better shape and size for a finger food.
Hmm.
And think about the texture as well. So you want it to be soft enough that children can easily bite through it with their teeth, or particularly for babies with their gums. So if it's a weaning stage, we're thinking about, you can do the test between your thumb and your forefinger. Can you break it off? Imagining that is their gums.
Hmm.
Can you break it off easily enough so it's not going to be too hard, too chunky? You want it to be soft and sort of pliable. So you're thinking about the size, bigger is better. You're thinking about the shape. Is it really round and chunky, or could it be sort of flatter and wider? And you're also thinking about the texture. Can I squish it easily between my thumb
Hmm.
and forefinger? If it's hard, then that's likely to be more of a choking risk. And
Hmm.
that's why things like, the classic choking risk foods are things like whole nuts, because they're
Hmm.
hard and round, but
Yeah.
also whole grapes, because when they've got
Yes.
skin on, they're actually really difficult for children to sort of perhaps bite through or chomp through with their gums, but also if it slips down, it's very difficult to squeeze
Hmm.
down in their throat or to dislodge. So with some fruits and vegetables, you want to think about removing skin, pips,
Hmm.
seeds, any of those tougher stringy bits as well, for
Hmm.
children. But as I say, there is a really good guide, because it's not just fruits and vegetables, it's also things like popcorn, for example, the
Yeah.
nuts, even pieces of sausage, because the skin can sometimes be quite
Hmm.
tough on the sausages, thinking about how those are cut. So rather than cutting them into chunks where it's a very round chunk, think
Hmm.
about slicing them lengthways and cutting them in
Hmm.
quarters, so that actually it's very, very slim. And
Hmm.
that is less likely to cause a blockage in the airways should
Hmm.
that happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we'll put the links to the guides in this episode description as well for people to access. So that's really useful. Thank you. So I think let's move on to talking about this kind of naturally falls into talking about portion sizes. So we've thought about the kind of the sizes of individual pieces of items of food, but what about food? Like actual portions. So we need to make sure that there's enough of all, I guess, food groups on the plate, or children are consuming throughout the day. And but also considering the fact that children grow very rapidly. So there's a big difference between, for example, a 6-month-old and a 5-year-old. And we're talking here about under five nutrition. And, there's that really needs to be accounted for in terms of portion sizes, right? So we need to really think about how much is enough. I know in the previous episode you talked about children judging that for themselves as well, so making sure that they understand when they are full, and that's really important, and making sure that they're able to self-serve as well, rather than just piling food up onto a child's plate and that being too much or too little. But sometimes we might put food on a child's plate and they're just not eating anything, then we give them so many different options, so then we do worry, don't we, in terms of, well, that child is clearly not eating enough. So we still need to kind of have an understanding of portion sizes in order to be able to understand what can we do more to support the children who might be struggling to get enough food, or who might be overeating perhaps.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Again, something I get asked a lot about. And
Hmm.
like everything in the world of nutrition, there's no sort of black and white answer,
Mm.
unfortunately. We do have some really good portion size guidance in the UK. There's some really great documents out there which have some fantastic resources when it comes to portion size guidance. The EYFS nutrition guidance has some portion size information in it. There's also a fantastic resource from an organization called First Nutrition, with some
Hmm.
really useful portion size guidance. And the way that all of that guidance is designed is to essentially make sure that children are receiving all the nutrients across the day, all that enough energy to support their growth needs, based on the fact that we're offering a variety of different foods in those portion
Hmm.
sizes across three main meals and two or three snacks a day, talking about sort of 12 months upwards. Babies,
Hmm.
if we're talking about weaning, they don't need snacks in between their meals. We rely on milk for their sort of top up snacks in between. So we're talking really about from 12 months to 5 years.
Hmm.
Um, the way that that guidance is kind of calculated, if you like, because there is science behind it, is to say if a child was eating a good balance of foods with three main meals and two or three healthy snacks in between, how much would they need to be having of each food group to
Hmm.
make sure that they're meeting all of their nutritional needs? So that's how the portion size guidance is kind of calculated.
Hmm.
Like I say, there is some science behind it. There is some
Hmm.
accuracy behind that. But what we know is that children don't eat the same amount consistently. Their
Yeah.
appetite varies hugely from one day to the next, even one meal to the next. And there are lots of things that are going to affect their appetite as well. So if they're going through a growth spurt, you might find that actually they're wanting more food. If they're going through less of a growth spurt, their appetite slows. If they are feeling ill or under the weather,
Mm.
or a bit unsettled, maybe they've just started nursery or they've moved to a new transition to a new room in the nursery setting or the early years setting. All of these things can affect their appetite, just as you
Hmm.
or I, if we had
Yeah.
a presentation to do at work, we feel it in our tummies, we might not be up to eating. If
Hmm.
we're feeling a bit under the weather, we only fancy certain foods. So there's some very natural variation in appetite which we
Hmm.
have to look out for and we have to be mindful of. So rather than sort of viewing these portion size guidelines as a fixed rule for every meal or every snack or every day, I think it's much more helpful to sort of use that, particularly if you're in an earlier setting, use that guidance as a benchmark. It helps you
Hmm.
to plan how much to order, how much to serve, how much to
Hmm.
prepare. And I would generally say, particularly if you have children who are cautious eaters, I would generally say start off small first. It's less overwhelming for children. And then you can always offer them more if they want more. So it is
Hmm.
very much about sort of responding to their cues. We talked about responsive feeding last time. So we know every child is different. And you're going to have one 4-year-old in your setting who will eat very differently to another 4-year-old.
Hmm.
Know the children, understand their appetites, look out for those things that are sort of signs of fullness. If they're
Hmm.
stopping, they're pushing food away, they're saying no. We don't want to push them or pressure them to finish everything on their plate if they are communicating with us that they've had enough. Equally, look out for those days when they are super hungry and they are asking for
Hmm.
second helpings, and respond to that in the same way, allow them those second helpings. So it's important to sort of promote and follow that responsive feeding approach. But you can use that portion size guidance to help you plan and prepare to a
Hmm.
certain degree. And that's why, I always say to settings or parents that I'm working with, it's very much really about feeding to appetite. We're not sort of
Hmm.
dictating, we don't want to have that you must finish your plate sort of attitude, because we need to recognize that appetite does vary from day to day,
Hmm.
from meal to meal. And it can feel, either as a early years professional or a parent or carer, it can feel really disheartening and very worrying when children don't eat very much.
Yeah.
I think what's important to remember is that a child's appetite is a bit like a roller coaster. There's going to be peaks
Hmm.
and troughs all the way through. So rather than focusing on one meal or one day or even one week's intake, just
Hmm.
remind yourself that they are very good at understanding their own appetite. And there might be something going on. Maybe they're coming down with a cough or a cold or something that's making
Hmm.
their appetite reduced. Ride that out. And usually, what you will find is that in a few days or a week or so's time, their appetite picks up again to
Hmm.
make up for any sort of lost time, if you like.
Right. Okay.
So
Mm.
it's not about how much they're eating today in the here and now. We need to look at the bigger picture, zoom out and think about the overall picture. The most important thing you can do is respond to their cues and their signals, really.
Hmm. Yeah. So looking at everything in through a holistic lens, I guess. Yeah.
Yes,
Hmm.
absolutely. Yeah.
And I guess let's move on to lunchboxes now. This is something that we didn't get a chance to cover in the last episode because there was so much to talk about. But I think lunchboxes is where things can get a little bit more difficult sometimes because it's so easy to just throw in some kind of packaged snacks
Mm.
that can be, unfortunately, as we talked about, full of refined sugar or those ultra processed foods. So, what's your advice for lunchboxes in terms of let's talk about parents and carers first, what to put into lunchboxes, and then maybe we can discuss how do we manage lunchboxes in an early year setting because there's difficulties there around, well, firstly allergies, and then bridging that conversation with parents and carers if the lunchboxes, if they're not very nutritious.
Yes, good question. Lunchboxes is a big topic, isn't it? So
Mm.
I think it can be quite difficult with lunchboxes to get lots of variety in there,
Hmm.
to get the same of variety that you would have in a hot cooked meal. But it is possible. It just takes planning and preparation, really. And the
Hmm.
key thing to think about is different food groups. So just as we would if we were planning a menu or planning a meal at home, we would want to think about making sure we've got a balance of having some fruits or vegetables, some carbohydrates, and some iron-rich protein in there as well,
Hmm.
and potentially some dairy foods. So think about those as your four main food groups. So how can you get a portion of fruit or vegetable in there? Well, things like obviously a whole piece of fruit or vegetable. So that might be an apple or a small apple, it might be half a banana, a little tangerine. You could also do little pots of berries. Tinned fruit is really good as well. So as long as it's tinned in juice and not syrup, remember going
Hmm.
back to our sugar
Yeah.
conversation, the syrup is something we want to really stay away from, but tinned fruit in juice is your friend. So it counts as one of your five a day. It's quite a cheap thing to a quite cheap option when it comes to fruits and vegetables,
Hmm.
and it has a great shelf life in comparison to fresh fruits or veg.
Yes.
So
Hmm.
if you've got tinned fruit, it could be pineapple, peaches, pears, plums, whatever you've got, as long as it's in juice, and you could put that into a sort of Tupperware
Hmm.
pot or container that's sealed. You don't actually have to serve the juice. You could just drain the juice out and just have the fruit in there, and
Hmm.
have a little fork or a fruit pick or something to make it easy for children to be able to eat. That's one of the key
Hmm.
things to think about, is the practicalities of your lunchbox as well. So how easy is
Yes.
it? How messy is it going to be? How does your child cope with eating certain things? So tinned fruits or vegetables can be a good option as well. And of course, you can get fruits and vegetables into some of the main dishes. So if you were making like a pasta
Hmm.
dish that you could have in your lunchbox and keep it in a thermos, or have a
Hmm.
cold pasta salad, you can incorporate lots of vegetables into that as well. So making sure you've got at least one portion of fruits or vegetables in your lunchbox is important, as well as a portion of starchy carbohydrate. Now, that might be that you've got sandwiches and the bread is your carbohydrate. It could be wraps, it could be pita breads, it
Hmm.
could be flatbreads, it could be naan bread, it could be pasta. Like I said, you can have a hot pasta dish in a thermos in the winter, you could have a cold pasta salad in the summer, it could be
Hmm.
rice dishes, it could be couscous. Lots of different options when it comes to those. And I think one of the key things as well is to try and vary it as much as possible. It can be really easy to default to a cheese sandwich every day for your lunchbox.
Yeah.
And that might be quick and easy, and you know your child is going to eat it. But we want to think a little bit about that exposure as well. If we get them used
Hmm.
to lots of different foods in their packed lunches, you're setting that precedent, if you like.
Mm. Yeah.
So carbohydrates important, really important for children for energy. It's a bit like a fuel for our body. So just like we put petrol
Hmm.
into our cars, children especially need those carbohydrates as their fuel. It's a really
Of
important source
course.
of fuel, particularly for their brain. So when they're having busy days and learning lots, we want to make sure that they're getting carbohydrate for that energy. And you can do a mixture of sometimes white, sometimes brown for children. For adults, we
Hmm.
know we should be having more of the whole grain, more of the brown varieties. And we do want children to have that too, because we know that children in this country aren't getting enough fibre, but a mixture of white and brown is absolutely fine for children.
Hmm.
So we've got carbohydrates and we've got our fruits and vegetables. The iron-rich protein is really key as well. And it's the iron that actually is really important for children. It's not so much the
Hmm.
protein, because actually protein we do get from lots of the other food groups as well. We will get it
Hmm.
from some of our carbohydrates. We will get it from things like milk and cheese and those dairy foods. But it's the iron-rich protein that we really want from this food group. And that might be things like meats, fish, eggs, beans, pulses, lentils, chickpeas, nut butters as well would
Mm,
also go
yeah.
into that food group. Now, depending on what your packed lunch is for, you may not be able to put nut butters in there if it's for
Hmm.
an early years setting or for a school setting. But at home, that can be a great option, or for picnics and things. So it could be that you've got sliced meat in your sandwich or in a pasta salad. It could be
Hmm.
that you have got things like beans or pulses, even peas, because they're a legume, will count towards that iron rich protein. So a great thing to incorporate into those pasta salads, rice salads, couscous salads. Fish as well is a great option. So you could have
Hmm.
like a mackerel pate, which is great for dipping. You could have some vegetable sticks to
Mm,
dip
yeah.
into. Hummus is a really good option as well for that iron rich protein, because it's made from chickpeas. So a
Mhm.
really great option. Again, you could have that in a sandwich potentially with grated carrot and a hummus sandwich, for example, or a
Mhm.
wrap, or you could have your veggie sticks or some breadsticks or crackers to dip into a little pot of hummus in the lunchbox. So lots of ways you can get that iron rich protein in. It's just thinking and having that time to plan and prepare it
Mm.
beforehand. And then for the dairy food group, things like cheese and yogurts, a little carton of milk, if your child enjoys drinking milk, they all tick
Mhm.
the boxes when it comes to that dairy food group, or those dairy alternatives. So if your child is dairy free, you can go for things like a soya or a dairy free based cheese, yogurt, oat yogurts, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Just making sure with those dairy free options that they are fortified with calcium at the very least,
Mhm.
so that we're not missing out on a key
Yeah,
calcium
that's a good point.
source. But
Mhm.
again, cheese in a sandwich or in a wrap, or you could have strips of cheese as a sort of snacking option alongside your pasta salad.
Mhm.
Yogurts, ideally going for plain yogurts rather than flavored yogurts, because the flavored ones do tend to have that added
Mhm.
sugar or added sweetness in there. So plainer options are always best from that point of view. So it can be quite easy to tick off all of those food groups for a
Mm.
packed
Yeah.
lunch. There's lots of different options, but as I say, it is just a case of planning and preparing it in advance,
Mhm.
so that you've got all of those options available in the fridge, and that you've got the time to prep those lunch
Mhm.
boxes. And that's the difficulty, I think, for a lot of parents. Often we're really time poor. We don't have the time to prepare all of these things, and that's where we tend to rely more on the packaged snacks, more on those ultra processed foods, because they are so
Mhm.
much more convenient. And that's fine to do from time to time, but if your child is having a packed lunch every day or several days a week, it can very easily sort of creep up the amount and the number of those packaged ultra processed foods that they're
Mhm.
having.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess for early year settings, it's all about working with the parents and carers and making sure that you are looking at what's in the lunch boxes and having those conversations and making sure that parents are not being made to feel bad about their choices as well, like you mentioned earlier, and having the discussions around what's healthy and pointing parents to, I guess, suitable snack options, different ideas for them to kind of think about so they're not just feeling a little bit lost of like, I'm doing everything wrong, but I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Angelica. It's about that communication with parents.
Mm.
Parents can't be expected to know all of this. And actually,
Yeah.
even early years professionals, it's very difficult to understand how do we meet the new guidance, particularly when it comes to packed lunches, when it's outside of your control. At Nursery Kitchen, we actually have a lunchbox policy, a sort of an example template, which
Hmm.
we share with earlier settings, and it's a great idea to have a lunchbox policy because it's a way of sort of writing down all of those unwritten rules instead of having the same conversations with parents all the time. It becomes a policy, it becomes a blanket document.
Mm,
Parents don't feel necessarily like they're being singled out or targeted.
yes.
This is just our
Hmm.
lunchbox policy, and it'd be great if you could read it and comply with it as much as possible. um, so it's a way of writing down all of those unwritten rules,
Hmm.
helping you as an early year setting to stick to the guidance, or at least demonstrate that you are supporting parents in trying to meet the guidance. And also sharing ideas, because in that packed lunch policy, and if anybody would like to have a look at the nursery kitchen one, we will share that with you. But there are some ideas in there, some sort of examples of things that you could include, like we've just talked about. And that's a really nice way of just being able to share that with parents. So they've got some ideas,
Hmm.
they've got sort of an understanding of what your expectation is when it comes to lunch boxes,
Hmm.
and it helps to sort of facilitate some of those conversations a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just thinking, I wanted to go back again to choking because you mentioned earlier things like tangerines, and I'm just thinking about
Mm.
those small segments. So I was at an event recently, and there was a talk about safeguarding, and they mentioned choking, and they were talking about potentially even cutting blueberries. So those small. I know you said like the bigger pieces of fruit and things like that is better. But what about the pieces of fruit, for example, that are already quite small, like blueberries, small segments of tangerines, etc.? What do we
Mm.
do about those things? I know you
Yeah.
mentioned about them being squishable as well.
Yes. It's a good question. And I think again, thinking about the age and the stage and the oral motor
Mm,
skill development of each individual child is really important. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We've heard it a lot for years and years with grapes. Cut them in half,
mhm,
or for infants under 12 months who might be having grapes, cut them into quarters as well.
mhm.
Or children who developmentally are struggling a little bit with food and chewing, then we might cut them in quarters.
And making sure that we
Um,
cut them lengthways as well, rather than kind of
Lengthways.
circular.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. So always cut it lengthways so that you're still not left with that very round
Mm.
shape. And the same, actually, blueberries, sometimes they're as big as grapes, aren't they, these
Yes, yeah.
days? So actually, yes, if you've got a young child who is having whole blueberries, whether that's in your setting or in the lunchbox, it's probably a good idea to cut them in half if they are under
Hmm.
5, yeah, because they can be quite big. I think with things like the tangerines, again, it's just assessing that child's individual capability when it comes to feeding.
Mm.
And you could absolutely slice them if you were uncomfortable, if you were feeling nervous. It's always
Hmm.
better to err on the side of caution if you're unsure. Then the segments of tangerine aren't usually sort of very round, but they can have a tough skin on them. And if the child
Mm.
hasn't got lots of teeth and is not they don't have the developmental or motor skills to cope with that shape and size, then yes, it probably would be a good idea to cut those as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah, yeah, great. Thank you. Well, we're coming to an end of this to this discussion. So thank you very much, Catherine, for joining again. It's really great to have you on and talking about all these different aspects that are really important, from sugar to lunch boxes, portion sizes, and really digging a little bit deeper into these important topics. For everyone who's listening, you can find out more about Nursery Kitchen in the link in this episode description, and also read Catherine's article as well as listen to the previous episode. The link is also in this episode description. So, yeah, once again, Catherine, thank you very much. It's been great to have you on again, and thank you for taking all my questions. And I thought I'll kind of, as you spoke, I thought, oh, I'll ask this and I'll ask that as well. So, thank you very much for that.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. I could talk about nutrition and food all day, so it's never a problem for me.
Yes, I
But
can tell.
thank you so much for having me again.